It began with silence. Not the kind that rests in peace, but the kind that waits, the kind before history cracks open. In the dim corridors of the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, December 1941, a man sat alone by the window. Takeo Yoshikawa. Naval officer. Spy. Patriot. He was 29 years old, and in his mind the empire's fate hung by a thread of radio code and memory. Outside, the Pacific shimmered with a deceptive calm. The trade winds moved softly across the palms, carrying faint traces of salt and fuel. Yoshikawa adjusted his glasses and lifted his pen. What he wrote that evening, the details of ships, their positions, their silhouettes against the harbor's glow, would travel across thousands of miles of ocean. Those words would wake a sleeping war. But this story isn't about what he got right. It's about what came after. When his empire asked for more, and when the same man and those like him sent back numbers that would betray them. If you've never heard how Japan's most disciplined spy network became useless, undone by pride, distance, and a single American aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, then stay. Because what follows is a story rarely told, buried under reports and silence. And if you find truth in the forgotten corners of history, subscribe. This story deserves to be remembered. In the first years of the Pacific War, Japanese intelligence was a paradox. Brilliant minds, trained in secrecy, fluent in foreign tongues, yet trapped inside an empire that distrusted its own information. Takeo Yoshikawa had once been the golden boy of the Naval Academy, a student of tactics and codes. But his brilliance was laced with fanaticism. To him, the emperor was divine law, and the empire's enemies, inevitable shadows to be erased by will. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yoshikawa's name vanished from official reports. He was recalled, questioned, silenced. The empire that had once prized his sharp eyes now feared the weight of his knowledge. But the machine of espionage kept moving. In 1943, Japan was bleeding, island by island, convoy by convoy, and Tokyo's spymasters demanded clarity. They needed to know what was coming from the American factories that roared day and night across the continent. Rumors had reached them. A new kind of fighter, faster, higher, unstoppable. American pilots called it the Mustang. At first, Tokyo dismissed it. Propaganda, they thought. Another boast from an enemy growing fat on its own industry. But whispers from occupied China, intercepted transmissions, and captured photographs began to tell a different story. The Allies had found something extraordinary, a machine that could escort bombers across the ocean and back. Yoshikawa, though exiled from Hawaii, still served the cause. Stationed back in Japan, he became part of a loose network gathering fragments. Reports from spies in India, engineers in Manchuria, even merchants in Lisbon trading rumor for currency. Every fragment passed through his hands, and every conclusion passed upward. The problem was distance and pride. Japanese intelligence officers, working thousands of miles from the factories of California and Detroit, had to build entire truths from shadows. They relied on whispers, translated through multiple agents, stripped of context by fear and censors. When one courier in Singapore said the new American plane had a long range, another in Berlin interpreted it as a slightly improved P-47. By the time it reached Tokyo, the description had been sanded down to insignificance. Minor variation, limited production. Yoshikawa read the summary with disbelief. He had seen enough of the enemy to know better. Yet when he argued, his superiors dismissed him. The Americans cannot match our Zero, they told him. Their planes are heavy, slow, wasteful. But deep down he sensed it, something was shifting. The Mustang wasn't born as a miracle. It was born from desperation. In 1940, before America even entered the war, the British had begged North American aviation for a fighter to replace their aging planes. The engineers built the Mustang in 117 days, a plane sleek, balanced, and agile but crippled at high altitudes. It wasn't until the British fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that it became something else entirely. By late 1943, the P-51D could fly over 400 miles per hour and escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. In the Pacific, it meant something terrifying. The Americans could strike from distances once thought impossible. But Tokyo didn't believe it. Japanese intelligence continued to send reports, thousands of pages, to the general staff. And many of those reports, compiled under Yoshikawa's oversight, contained critical errors. They underestimated range, misjudged production, ignored the significance of the Merlin engine entirely. In one decrypted file dated February 1944, a summary from the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal stated, "Enemy long-range fighter development remains in prototype stage. No immediate threat anticipated." By the time that message reached the Imperial Navy's command, Mustangs were already flying over the Mariana Islands. For Yoshikawa, it was more than failure. It was betrayal, of logic, of truth, of the craft he had devoted his life to. He began to doubt not only his colleagues but the empire itself. Every time he sent a coded report, he wondered if it would even matter. The system above him wanted comfort, not accuracy. They wanted to hear that Japan could still win, that their pilots were invincible, that the Zero, the proud symbol of Japanese air power, was still supreme. The truth was unbearable. The Zero, once a miracle, was obsolete. The Mustang could climb faster, dive longer, and survive what no Japanese aircraft could. In secret, Yoshikawa kept his own notes, estimates of Mustang performance, intercepted from Allied radio chatter and field reports from captured pilots. He calculated their ranges by hand, plotted their likely deployment zones, and tried to warn his superiors again. They ignored him. Instead, Tokyo promoted those who told better lies. Men who promised victory through spirit, who claimed the American pilots relied too much on machines. A plane cannot replace courage, they said. By 1945, that belief had burned half the empire to ash. When the Mustangs came, they came like ghosts. Over Iwo Jima, over Okinawa, over Tokyo, silver shadows cutting through the sky, their engines roaring like a promise fulfilled. They escorted bombers deep into Japanese airspace, swarming past interceptors that once ruled the Pacific. Pilots called them angels of death. Yoshikawa watched from the ground as the air raid sirens wailed. He saw them, the silhouettes he once tried to measure and dismiss, now dominating his homeland's skies. The machine he had tried to warn about was now the executioner of his world. The irony was suffocating. The intelligence that might have saved Japan's pilots had been wrong, not by accident but by design. Pride had rewritten the truth. The empire's spies had become useless, feeding the war machine with numbers it wanted to believe. And Takeo Yoshikawa, the man who once saw everything, could only watch as the sky turned red. They say spies live and die in silence. For Yoshikawa, silence was all that remained. After the war, he returned to a ruined Japan, unrecognized, unpaid, and blamed by many for the empire's blindness. The Americans never arrested him, they considered him insignificant. But history would later uncover that his early reports had shaped the war's beginning, and his later mistakes, its tragic end. He once told an interviewer years later, "We were defeated by information, not by bombs." In those words lies the heart of this story, an empire that could not see beyond its own illusions, and a man who tried too late to open its eyes. Because in war, truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. He used to believe in patterns, in the elegance of logic hidden beneath chaos. Intelligence work, to Yoshikawa, was a form of poetry, where fragments of intercepted messages, merchant whispers and stolen blueprints formed a verse that could change the fate of nations. But now, in the winter of 1943, that poetry was gone. All that remained were broken lines, half-truths, and orders written by men who no longer listened. Each report he received from abroad arrived twisted by optimism. From Berlin came the assurance that German scientists believed the Mustang was a luxury plane, heavy and wasteful in fuel. From Bangkok came a courier's coded message claiming that American pilots themselves mocked the aircraft as too fragile for the Pacific. These words were lies, yet they were the lies that Tokyo wanted to hear. And Yoshikawa, bound by duty, kept translating them, refining them, disguising his own doubt between the lines. He tried at first to resist quietly. In one report, he inserted his own observation, that Allied bombers were beginning to fly farther than before, that their escorts never seemed to turn back. It was a subtle warning, a whisper between the lines. But the officer who reviewed his paper struck out the paragraph, stamping in red ink the phrase, "Speculation, not evidence." Evidence, he thought. What evidence did they expect, when every real source had been silenced by war? The foreign diplomats who once carried coded cables were gone. The merchant ships that once smuggled photographs had been sunk. The telegraph lines to Europe were cut. Japan's eyes were closing one by one, and all that remained was the comfort of self-deception. Yoshikawa's work became mechanical. Reading what he knew was false, writing what he knew was pointless. Yet beneath that mechanical rhythm, something in him began to break. He found himself dreaming of the Mustang. In those dreams it wasn't a plane but a shape in the distance. A silver phantom always beyond reach, slicing through the clouds with the calm certainty of inevitability. When he woke he felt the same dread as the day he first heard the name. He'd seen what faith in machines could do. He had seen Pearl Harbor. And he knew, with the same clarity that once guided his reports, that Japan was about to face something it could not outfly. But he was only one man, buried under a mountain of paper. Above him sat layers of command, officers trained to obey, bureaucrats trained to agree, and admirals too proud to question their own victories. The empire had begun to feed on its own illusions, turning propaganda into policy and policy into faith. Spirit will triumph over science, they told him. The Zero remains the purest expression of Japanese genius. No foreign engine can surpass it. Those words were repeated like a prayer. They decorated banners, echoed through military schools, filled the airwaves. To doubt them was to doubt the emperor himself. So Yoshikawa learned silence. He wrote what they wanted. He adjusted figures, softened warnings, translated his fear into polite caution. But in his private notebooks he began to collect the fragments that others ignored. A single line from a British newspaper. A photograph smuggled through a neutral port. A pilot's testimony from a captured radio broadcast. Piece by piece he built the truth they refused to see. He calculated the Mustang's potential range based on its fuel load and the new Merlin engine. He compared Allied factory production rates and shipping capacities. The numbers frightened him. If his calculations were even close, America could soon field thousands of these planes. That meant Japan's island bases, their proud ring of defense, would become cages. The Zero, once unmatched, would be hunted from the sky. He imagined young pilots, boys barely trained, flying into battles they could not win because their leaders had been fed false hope. Sometimes when he walked through the streets of Yokosuka, he saw them, fresh-faced recruits laughing outside the training halls, unaware of the ghosts gathering above them. He wanted to tell them the truth. He wanted to say that courage was not enough, that devotion could not outfly technology. But he said nothing. He simply bowed as they passed, watching their shadows stretch and fade under the dim lamps of wartime Japan. At night, the air raid sirens wailed across the city. The Americans were coming closer. Factories worked without pause, forging aircraft that could no longer compete. And still, the reports from intelligence bureaus painted a different picture. Enemy fighter production decreasing. American morale low. Lies written by men who no longer knew the difference between survival and delusion. Yoshikawa's despair grew into obsession. He spent nights tracing the routes of American raids, comparing the distances that their bombers traveled. Each time he saw the same pattern. The escorts lasted longer, reached farther, and returned safely. The implications were terrifying. The Mustang had become the perfect companion to the B-29, the weapon that would burn cities to ash. And yet, within the Imperial General Staff, the myth persisted. The enemy's fuel reserves were stretched, their new planes unreliable, their pilots untested. He tried once more to speak. At a meeting in early 1944, surrounded by uniformed officers and the scent of ink and tobacco, Yoshikawa stood to present his findings. His voice trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. He laid out his estimates, the range, the speed, the ceiling. He spoke of the new engine, of the Allied capacity to mass-produce it. He showed maps with red lines stretching from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, lines that represented death. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then one of the admirals laughed softly. "You give the enemy too much credit," he said. "Perhaps you have been reading their propaganda too closely." Another officer added, "Even if they have such machines, they lack the spirit to use them as we do." The others nodded. The meeting ended. His report was archived. The truth was buried again. That night, Yoshikawa walked alone through the Navy compound. The cherry trees were bare, their branches clawing at the cold air. He thought of the first time he had sworn allegiance to the emperor, the pride he felt as a young cadet. He thought of the coded cables he had once sent from Hawaii, the precision with which he had described the American fleet. Back then he believed knowledge was power. Now knowledge was a curse. He began to drink. His once perfect handwriting became uneven. His reports shorter, colder. He still did his duty, he always would, but a quiet defiance had taken root. In the margins of one report, he scribbled a line that no censor noticed: "We have become blind by choice." Weeks later, the first Mustangs appeared over the Pacific in numbers that could no longer be denied. The Empire's denial cracked, but it was too late. The intelligence network scrambled to adjust. Orders came down demanding new estimates, updated figures, emergency assessments. Yoshikawa read the frantic telegrams with hollow eyes. Now they wanted the truth, but the truth had already killed them. He watched the Empire's information machine devour itself. Agents accused each other of incompetence. Reports contradicted reports. Entire files vanished, rewritten to fit a new narrative. And at the center of it, Yoshikawa continued to write, his words now a ghostly echo of what they once were. He no longer believed they would change anything. The Mustang was no longer a rumor. It was reality, roaring above the Pacific like a storm that no one could stop. And still, Tokyo issued proclamations of faith. "The enemy is desperate," they declared. "Their final strength will soon break." But Yoshikawa knew better. He had seen enough of history to recognize its cruel rhythm. The same arrogance that had brought victory at Pearl Harbor was now leading them to ruin. In the end, he realized that intelligence was not about information at all, it was about belief. And belief, once corrupted, could destroy nations faster than any bomb. He returned home late one evening, his hands still stained with ink, his eyes hollow. His wife asked what troubled him, but he only shook his head. He could not tell her that the war was already lost, not because of the enemy's strength, but because his own people refused to see it. Outside, the night hummed with distant engines. He looked up at the dark sky and thought he could almost hear the low growl of mustangs somewhere beyond the horizon. It was a sound he would come to know well, a sound that would soon define the end of everything he once believed in. By the spring of 1944, the Empire's maps were bleeding. Red pins that once marked victory now vanished under waves of black ink. Each morning, new reports arrived at the Naval Intelligence Bureau in Tokyo, and each one spoke in the same quiet language of collapse. Convoys sunk. Bases lost. Pilots missing. Yet, inside the walls of the command building, the air was still heavy with certainty. Officers spoke of counterattacks that would turn the tide. They drew arrows across maps with trembling hands, pretending they still controlled the direction of history. Yoshikawa sat at his desk, watching. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, his face thin from sleepless nights. He had stopped believing in rescue long ago. The war had become an equation with no solution, one that even the most loyal mind could not balance. But he kept working because that was what he knew how to do. Every morning he opened a new folder, read the coded messages from abroad, and translated them into words that might reach someone who cared. One message from Berlin described the Allied bombers striking deeper into Germany than ever before, escorted by sleek silver aircraft of remarkable endurance. Another came from Lisbon, where a merchant whispered that the Americans had built thousands of new fighters, capable of crossing oceans without refueling. And yet, when those words reached Tokyo, they became something else. Enemy long-range development continues but shows little progress. The truth was rewritten before it ever reached the men who needed it most. He realized then that Japan's intelligence system was not collapsing from lack of information, but from too much fear. Each layer of command softened reality to protect itself. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to tell the emperor that the enemy had already surpassed them. By the time the truth reached the top, it had been stripped of meaning. In the mess hall, he listened to young officers debate the rumors. One said that the new American plane used fuel so pure it could not be produced in wartime quantities. Another claimed it was made of aluminum so thin that a single bullet would shatter it. They laughed, confident that the Empire's spirit would prevail. Yoshikawa said nothing. He had learned that silence was safer than reason. He carried in his coat pocket a small notebook, the one he had filled with his secret calculations. He had copied it by hand over and over in case the Kempeitai came looking for subversive writings. Inside were numbers that no one wanted to see: the Mustang's cruising speed, the engine specifications, the altitude at which Japanese interceptors failed to climb. He had pieced it all together from scraps, and now in the margins he had written his conclusion: "We have already lost the air." The words haunted him. By the time the Americans captured the Marianas, the sky above Japan belonged to someone else. The Mustangs came in waves, their silver wings flashing like light off broken glass. They weren't just machines, they were symbols of everything Japan had refused to understand. Precision, production, adaptation. The virtues the empire had once mocked as soulless were now the tools of its destruction. One morning, Yoshikawa stood outside the bureau and watched a group of schoolchildren march past, waving flags and singing about victory. Their voices were thin, high, and pure, rising over the sound of distant air raid drills. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe there was still something sacred left in the idea of Japan. But then the sirens began again and the illusion dissolved. That afternoon, the first firebombing of Tokyo began. He watched from the rooftop as the horizon turned red. The city burned like paper. The flames moved faster than thought, swallowing streets, houses, and memories. The air smelled of smoke and iron and something faintly sweet, the scent of everything human turning to ash. The reports that came afterward were a blur of denial. Enemy losses estimated high. Civilians show great morale. But Yoshikawa knew what he had seen. There was no morale left, only endurance. People no longer looked up at the sky. They just listened for the engines, prayed for silence, and waited. Inside the bureau, paranoia grew. Officers accused one another of sabotage, of leaking information, of defeatism. Files disappeared. The telephone lines buzzed with rumors that traitors had infiltrated the intelligence service. Some whispered Yoshikawa's name. After all, he had once lived among Americans. He spoke their language. He had predicted too much. One night, two men from the Kempitai arrived at his door. They asked polite questions at first, then not so polite ones. Where had he obtained his data? Why did his personal notes differ from official reports? Was he attempting to undermine morale? He told them he was only trying to serve the emperor with accuracy. They left without arresting him, but the warning was clear. From then on, he stopped writing anything that resembled truth. But the silence did not bring peace. It brought guilt. Every time he saw another pilot's photograph pinned to the memorial board, he wondered if a single honest report might have saved one of them. If his numbers, had they been believed, could have changed even one order. The guilt became a weight in his chest that no drink could dull. By late 1944, the Mustang ruled the Pacific. It escorted B-29s from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. It shredded Japan's last defenses, tore apart what remained of its air force. The intelligence sections were flooded with desperate analyses trying to explain the unexplainable. Some blamed bad weather, others poor radar, others fate. None blamed the system itself. Yoshikawa began to see the end as an inevitability. The empire's codebreakers had once prided themselves on reading the minds of enemies. Now they could barely read their own reality. Reports were still sent to the front, full of optimism, predicting victories that never came. He sometimes wondered if even the emperor knew the truth, or if the web of illusion reached that high. One evening, as he walked home through the ruins of Yokohama, he saw a single Mustang circling overhead. The sun caught its wings, and for a moment it looked like a bird of light. Then it tilted, dove, and vanished beyond the clouds. He thought of how that shape, that single machine, had been born from precision and logic, everything Japan had once considered soulless, and how that very precision had defeated faith. He realized then that the empire had never truly understood its enemy. They had measured spirit but ignored science, praised sacrifice but neglected reason. The Americans, for all their arrogance, had understood something simpler, that truth, tested and refined, always triumphs over myth. That night, Yoshikawa returned to his room and opened his notebook for the last time. He tore out the pages one by one and burned them in a small iron tray. The paper curled and blackened, the numbers dissolving into smoke. He watched the ashes drift upward as if the truth itself were trying to escape the earth. When the final page was gone, he whispered to no one, they never wanted to know. Then he closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of engines beyond the horizon. The sound was distant but growing. He knew what it meant. The storm was coming. The sound began before dawn, low and constant, like the ocean breathing beneath the earth. Yoshikawa woke to it before the sirens, before the shouting in the streets. The air itself seemed to vibrate. He stepped outside and looked up. The sky was not yet light, but he could see them, hundreds of tiny red dots moving in formation, engines murmuring like a chorus of ghosts. Then came the first explosion. A second later, the sirens screamed. Tokyo burned again. The Mustangs appeared first, darting through the thin clouds like silver knives. Behind them came the B-29s, enormous and deliberate, their bomb bays opening as if the sky itself were splitting apart. Yoshikawa watched from the edge of the compound, his breath caught somewhere between awe and terror. He had studied these planes for years. He knew their dimensions, their flight patterns, their vulnerabilities. But knowledge no longer mattered. The air was filled with something far beyond calculation, an unstoppable certainty. The bombs fell in waves. He could feel the shock through the ground, through his ribs, through the very air he breathed. Streets vanished in flame. The river glowed orange, filled with floating embers that had once been rooftops. The city's heart was being erased. He tried to move, to help, but everywhere was chaos. People ran toward shelters that no longer existed. Others stood frozen, their faces lit by the firestorm's glow. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. Somewhere in the distance, ammunition stores began to detonate, each explosion folding into the next until the sky itself seemed to scream. Yoshikawa stumbled toward the bureau, coughing through smoke. The building had already been hit. The windows were shattered, the walls scorched black. Inside, files burned in their cabinets, shelves collapsing under the weight of fire. He could see the papers curling into ash, years of reports, lies, and silence vanishing in seconds. For a brief, delirious moment, he thought that maybe this was mercy, that perhaps the fire was the only thing honest left. He found one surviving clerk clutching a box of documents, eyes wide with panic. "We must save the intelligence archives," the man shouted. Yoshikawa took the box, looked inside, and saw nothing but useless pages. False numbers, fabricated victories, the illusions that had fed the Empire's pride. He dropped the box into the fire. The clerk screamed, but Yoshikawa only watched as the flames consumed it. When the roof finally gave way, he ran into the street. The air was thick with ash and burning paper. Some of the pages lifted high into the sky, glowing briefly before disappearing into the smoke. It looked almost beautiful, truth and lies alike turning to light. By nightfall, the bombing had stopped, but Tokyo no longer existed. The city was a plain of ruins. The smell of melted stone and wet ashes clung to everything. Bodies lay in the gutters, silent and small, their shadows still etched on the walls behind them. The silence that followed was worse than the fire. Yoshikawa wandered through it, half blind from smoke, his mind hollow. He thought of all the reports he had written, all the warnings ignored, all the numbers twisted into comfort. None of it mattered now. The empire he had served had been built on the belief that courage could defy reality. But courage could not stop the wind that carried fire. In the days that followed, he saw what denial looked like when it finally died. The survivors spoke in whispers. Government bulletins still claimed that the damage was limited, that civilian morale remains unshaken. But the truth was visible everywhere, in the eyes of mothers searching for children, in the silence of soldiers who no longer saluted, in the black sky where no planes of their own remained. When the next wave of raids came, there was no defense at all. The Mustangs swept low over the ruins, strafing roads and rail lines with mechanical precision. The B-29s followed, methodical and merciless. Yoshikawa no longer ran for shelter. He simply stood in the open watching. The sky was filled with silver arcs and trails of fire. He thought of the first time he had heard of the Mustang years ago, sitting in an office in Honolulu, writing down details about American ships. Back then, the future had been a blank page waiting to be filled. Now the page was burning in front of him. When the bombers left, he returned to what was left of the bureau. The remaining officers had gathered in a half-collapsed room, their uniforms covered in soot. One of them, an older man with trembling hands, was dictating a new report. "Enemy losses remain heavy," he said, voice cracking. "Our anti-aircraft units continue to inflict damage." Yoshikawa wanted to laugh, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. The others ignored him. They were still writing history as if it were a negotiation. That night, he sat alone amid the ruins and opened a surviving typewriter. The keys were scorched but still worked. He began to type without orders, without censors. He wrote the only honest report of his life. "Our intelligence has failed. Our strength was an illusion. The enemy's machines are not miracles, they are truths made of metal. And we refuse to see." He folded the page and placed it on the desk, though he knew no one would ever read it. Outside, the city glowed faintly under the moon, smoke rising in slow, endless spirals. He thought of the pilots above, The men in the Mustangs who had flown through the same darkness, guided by data, by precision, by an understanding of reality that Japan had denied. He envied them, not their victory but their clarity. When dawn came, the first American leaflets drifted down from the sky. They warned of more destruction, more fire, unless Japan surrendered. Yoshikawa picked one up from the street. The paper was thin and damp, the words foreign yet simple. "Your leaders lied to you," it said. "The war is lost." He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. It was the first truthful document he had held in years. Around him, the empire began to unravel. The trains no longer ran. The rice stores were empty. Families fled the cities for villages that no longer existed. Rumors spread of secret weapons, of miracle victories waiting to be revealed, but Yoshikawa knew better. The only miracle left was survival. In the summer of 1945, as the heat grew unbearable, he heard of new bombings far to the south, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The stories that filtered through were impossible at first. One plane, one bomb, entire cities gone. Even the most fanatical officers could not explain it. When he finally saw photographs smuggled from the ruins, he understood. The age of machines had ended the age of empires. He sat for a long time, staring at the images, his hands trembling. Everything he had believed in, honor, duty, secrecy, felt small against the scale of what had just happened. It wasn't just Japan that had been defeated. It was the idea that faith alone could shape reality. When the emperor's voice came over the radio in August, calm and distant, announcing surrender, Yoshikawa did not cry. He simply bowed his head and whispered, "It's over." The words felt both final and empty. He thought of all the reports still buried in burned archives, all the men who had died believing them. In that moment he understood that the greatest weapon of war had not been the Mustang, nor the bomb, but the lie. The lie that had convinced a nation to close its eyes and call it honor. And in that silence after the broadcast, as Japan fell still, Yoshikawa knew he would never serve again. The empire was gone, and with it, every illusion he had ever helped create. The war ended not with thunder, but with an echo. When the last of the fires cooled, Japan was a ghost of its former self, its cities flattened, its people silent, its gods dethroned. 4 weeks after the surrender, the sky remained empty, and that emptiness felt almost cruel. Yoshikawa had grown used to the hum of engines, the metallic rhythm of fear. Now silence itself felt foreign. He walked through the ruins of Tokyo, through streets where the outlines of buildings were burned onto the ground, through markets where survivors bartered memories for rice. Everything that once carried meaning had been stripped of it. The empire that had promised eternity had vanished in the span of a single broadcast. He found work sweeping debris from what used to be a government building. No one knew who he was anymore. The name Takeo Yoshikawa meant nothing in a land where names no longer carried consequence. He did not tell anyone that he had once been a spy, that his words had shaped the first strike at Pearl Harbor, that his reports had once reached the emperor's desk. He had seen what pride could do, he no longer needed it. At night, he slept in a shack built from scavenged planks, the air still smelling faintly of ash and rain. When he dreamed, it was always the same dream, an endless sky, silver planes crossing it, engines fading into silence. The Americans arrived not as monsters but as architects. They rebuilt, reorganized, rewrote. They brought food and order but also something more dangerous, truth. Newspapers returned to print. Radio spoke freely for the first time in memory. And for the first time Yoshikawa saw his own past laid bare. His name appeared briefly in a foreign paper. Former Japanese naval spy, believed responsible for early intelligence on Pearl Harbor. The article was factual, indifferent. It mentioned nothing of the years that followed, nothing of the lies he had fought against. History had reduced him to a single line, a prologue to disaster. He thought of turning himself in, of confessing everything to the occupation authorities. But when he finally stood outside their offices he stopped. The guards barely looked at him. To them he was just another old man in a line of the defeated. The world had moved on. His war was already forgotten. So he turned away back into the ruins. In the years that followed, Japan transformed faster than anyone could have imagined. Cities rose again, cleaner, brighter. The hum of machinery returned, but this time it was the hum of industry, of peace rebuilt from precision. The very logic and pragmatism Japan had once rejected became the foundation of its rebirth. The sons of soldiers became engineers. The daughters of widows became teachers. And slowly the nation learned to live with its ghosts. Yoshikawa lived quietly through it all. He took small jobs, teaching English to school children, translating manuals for American companies. He avoided politics, avoided the veterans who still spoke of honor and betrayal. He knew better than to argue. For him, the war was no longer about nations or glory. It was about blindness, the kind that comes not from ignorance but from choosing not to see. Sometimes he would visit the harbor. The ships there were different now, sleek, commercial, painted in peaceful colors. He would sit on the pier and watch the sky. Jets replaced the old propeller planes, faster, quieter, untouchable. Yet even then, when the sunlight hit the wings just right, he could still see the shape of the Mustang in them, the ghost of a lesson he could never unlearn. He once told a young student, curious about the war, "Machines don't win wars. But lies can lose them." The boy didn't understand. He nodded politely and went back to his notebook. Yoshikawa smiled faintly. Perhaps it was better that way. Perhaps the lesson was not meant to be inherited, only remembered. In 1955, an American journalist came to interview him. The man was polite, respectful, curious. He asked about Pearl Harbor, about the early days of espionage in Hawaii. Yoshikawa answered carefully, recounting the details with precision. But when the journalist asked about the later years, the false reports, the failure to warn of the Mustang, he fell silent. After a long pause, he said quietly, "We told ourselves what we wanted to believe. And belief, unchecked, becomes poison." The journalist wrote the words down, nodded, and left. Yoshikawa never read the article. He didn't need to. As the decades passed, his body weakened, but his mind remained sharp. He watched Japan rise into a new kind of power, economic, technological, pragmatic. The old generals were gone, their portraits replaced by engineers and inventors. The factories that once built warplanes now built cars and radios. The empire that once worshipped spirit had finally learned to worship truth. One evening, as the sun sank over the rebuilt city, he walked through a park where children were flying kites. The sky was clear, painted with streaks of red and gold. A boy ran past him, holding a paper kite shaped like an airplane. It caught the wind, soared high, and for a moment, its silhouette looked just like the Mustang's, sharp, graceful, unstoppable. Yoshikawa smiled, a small, tired smile. He thought of all the years he had spent trying to understand machines, trying to measure their souls. But there were no souls in machines, he realized. Only the reflections of the people who built them, their logic, their faith, their courage, their fear. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes. The wind was gentle now, carrying no smell of smoke. He thought of his mother, of the first time he saw the sea, of the young men he had once trained beside, all gone to ash. And he thought of that first report he had written in Honolulu, the one that had begun everything. A few lines of observation, a few simple numbers, and an empire had awakened to war. Words, he realized, were as dangerous as bombs when used without truth. As twilight deepened, he whispered to the air, "We were defeated by information, not by bombs." The wind carried the words away. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the horizon. The city lights flickered on, stretching endlessly, as if the stars themselves had fallen to earth to start again. For the first time in years he felt something close to peace. History had moved beyond him, but perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Every generation builds its own illusions, and every illusion eventually burns. What mattered was whether the truth that followed was enough to rebuild. The night settled over Tokyo, quiet and vast. Yoshikawa remained on the bench until the park lights dimmed. When he finally stood, the wind stirred the fallen leaves around his feet. He looked up once more at the sky, clear, infinite, and mercilessly honest, and gave a small bow as if to the ghosts of all he had once served. Then he turned and walked into the dark, leaving behind a world that had finally learned what he had known too late, that truth, once lost, can destroy empires and once found can save them. And as the city hummed with the sound of life reborn, the last spy of a vanished empire disappeared quietly into history.